got one done in 2011. So we were supposed to have like a Wolverine getaway and we came up to her about that. She wants me, she said she can drive from Caucus to Memphis. She wants me to take it right. And so we were supposed to do that. Yeah, so we were supposed to do it.
Have you ever been to Great Fun?
I was
I thought it was going to be so cool. And it is cool.
it was cool.
I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
That is Memphis.
Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the Wolverine Caucus. We like to think that the University of Michigan uses these caucuses to help to change the world one forum at a time. We're sponsored by the University of Michigan Alumni Association, the Office of the Vice President for Government Relations, and we're so excited that you're here today to hear a phenomenal speaker, one who probably needs no introduction because he's been here a number of times throughout the last 10 election cycles at least. To introduce him today, we have State Representative Marsha Hovey Wright, a U of M alum, go blue, and she is from the 92nd District, this great city of Muskegon, and Representative Hovey Wright is in her third term here in state government. So without further ado, Marsha Hovey Wright. Thank you for being here.
So, yes, I'm very proud to be here. I think I've attended maybe all since the 6 years I've been here, almost 6 years I've been here of the Wolverine Caucus forums. And not only am I a graduate of the School of Social Work at University of Michigan, but both of my kids, their father, and my grandson are also grads of U of M, and every one of my grandchildren has a hat, a t-shirt, or a onesie from U of M. So it's a pleasure to be here before you for today's Wolverine Caucus. To introduce our keynote speaker, we'll shed some light on this year's presidential election, and there is certainly lots of light to be shed. Michael Traugott was the speaker at every single presidential year and gubernatorial year. He was the speaker at this Wolverine Caucus, according to the founders who were sitting next to me. And this has been since the mid-'80s, so he's, as you said, he's been here before. But this, I think, is a really particularly interesting election for many of us. He is the research professor at the Center for Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research at U of M. Political scientist by training, Michael Traugott has been interested in public opinion research since his undergraduate days at Princeton, when he answered an ad for interviews at the Gallup organization. He has written extensively about campaigns and elections and public opinions and use of polls in journalism and survey methods, and has served as a consultant to a number of news organizations for their election coverage. And as you probably know, the last election, the polls were like way off, and they really affected where different organizations put their resources, and particularly in Michigan. Dr. Traugott is the author and co-author of 9 books and more than 75 journals and essays. And he's the past president of the American Association of Public Opinion Research and the World Association of Public Opinion Research. He has been fortunate to be able to spend his entire career at University of Michigan, earning both his MA, PhD from U of M. So before starting the Institute for Social Research and eventually becoming a senior research scientist and professor of communication studies. So with all of that, let us welcome Dr. Michael Traugott, who will be speaking to us about what kind of presidential election is this? Okay, I'm anxious to hear.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for that kind welcome, and to Veronica for inviting me again. It's good to be here. A lot of citizens in the United States find this campaign very disconcerting in a number of regards, but for political scientists, this is a much better than average presidential campaign. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about a variety of things, a little background about how we got here, some discussion of the current campaign. I'm going to talk to you also a little bit about a new research project that we are involved with the Gallup organization, the first results of which were published yesterday. And then I'll close with a few comments about what I think might happen or what you should look for between now and November 8th. So this is I brought a lot of slides. I'm going to race through the beginning slides and then slow down to a more normal pace. This is a picture of Jack Kennedy campaigning in 1960 in West Virginia in the primary. In the 1960s, the primaries were what's called beauty contests. They didn't have any particular meaning about who got to be the nominee. But in Kennedy's case, of course, because he was Catholic, he had to demonstrate some level of popular support, and he did it by selectively entering a few primaries. This was an important one to show his connection to working voters. This photo is from the Democratic Convention in 1968. These are members of the Chicago Police Department trying to disperse protesters, demonstrators outside the convention hall. And this is important, first of all, because this was one of the very first televised conventions. So while the Democrats were trying to conduct their business inside, this is mostly what appeared on television on the outside. And this got the Democrats thinking about changing the rules for nominating a candidate, because one of the things that came out of this convention was this notion of smoke-filled rooms. The delegations were populated by people who were political leaders or party regulars or party leaders, even if they weren't elected officials. This is just an early cartoon that shows the smoke-filled rooms in a generic kind of way. You notice these are all men, they're all white. This particular cartoon goes back to the very early 20th century. In 1972, we had the first nomination campaign, in which the Democrats had adopted a new set of rules proposed by the McGovern-Fraser Commission as a reaction to what happened in 1968. This is George McGovern on the right. He knew what the new rules were and how to operate under them. He got the nomination. Ran against Richard Nixon. He was beaten very soundly. And so, as a result of our reconsideration of 72, plus the Watergate incident, some changes took place in Congress and also within the parties. Both parties decided to adopt a primary and caucus schedule and to set in place a set of rules by which anybody who wanted to contest for the nomination had to enter primaries in order to get delegates. This is when Iowa and New Hampshire got their place at the beginning of the calendar. Iowa is the first caucus and New Hampshire is the first primary. And then there were a set of amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974 that provided for partial public financing of presidential elections. 40 years ago, the candidates were very interested in getting money from the federal government in order to support their campaigns, and they made a series of commitments for several sequences to do that. But by the year 2000, the candidates learned that they could raise more money on their own than they could get a check from than the size of the check from the federal government, and our public financing system is completely broken now and off the rails. 1976 was the first debate after the 1960 debates between Kennedy and Nixon. People believed that the Kennedy-Nixon debates were important for Kennedy's success in the general election campaign. Richard Nixon was criticized for his performance. He lost that election, but then he won the next two, but he refused to debate. In 1976, we had an unelected Republican president and a brand new Democratic candidate, and so the debates started again. And there was an incident in this debate which hurt the image of Gerald Ford during the campaign. We can talk about that later if you like. So after 1980, the Democrats adopted a superdelegate rule, which was a way to counterbalance what was perceived to be the effects of the primaries and caucuses on both sides. Namely that more ideological members of the party were participating in the primaries and more ideological candidates were being nominated by the parties. So the party regulars looked for a system whereby they could import some sense of political savvy and experience. And so a proportion of the delegates were set aside for party leaders again and elected officials. In the new system, a process of winnowing took place where there was a very rapid collapse to a consensus about who the nominee should be. It's based primarily on the fact that if you don't do well in the early events, you don't get any more press coverage, or the amount of press coverage declines, then the amount of contributions declines, then it's more and more difficult for you to carry on in the race. And so the media have become the major arbiter of who's ahead, who's behind, who's likely to succeed, and they're the main contributor to the winnowing process. Another dimension of that is this notion of momentum, that those who do well early do better in the polls, get better coverage, are able to raise more money, and then succeed better in the events that follow. And in almost all of these events, even though the calendar goes from January through June, we've known who the presumptive nominee would be by mid-March or early April, with the exception of 2008, between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And in this sequence, in 2016, we knew by mid-March or early April who the nominees would be. Both parties had out the smoke-filled room again. On the Clinton side, but with an eye towards the Bernie Sanders candidacy, there was concern about how she had locked up the support of the superdelegates very early on in the race. And this is a cartoon from the Republican side, where they're talking about how they're going to keep the nomination from Donald Trump, which of course turned out to be wishful thinking. So let me turn to some broad patterns or trends going on in the American electorate now, and talk a little bit about how they relate to the current contest. And I'm going to talk about five important things. Partisanship, about demographic shifts in the US population, about political polarization, about the uneven economic recovery we've experienced since 2008, but actually had raised concerns before that, and then also about the do-nothing Congress. We had two candidates, one who was unsuccessful, Bernie Sanders, and one who was successful, Donald Trump, who ran against the establishment primarily. And a lot of the concern about the current state of American government has to do with things not getting done in Washington, which is primarily a concern about the activities of the Congress. So this is a picture which I've showed you variations of before to illustrate the point that the United States is primarily a democratic country. That is, if you ask people in surveys, in politics as of today, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent? And then if you're an independent, well, do you lean more towards the Democratic Party or lean more towards the Republican Party? These are Gallup data since 1991. And they show that the light green line, there are more Democrats in the United States than Republicans. And actually that margin has been growing over time, in recent time. But our presidential elections are historically very close. And we think we understand that that happens because Democrats are less likely to vote than Republicans. And Republicans are more likely to be straight ticket voters or to support their party, I should say, the candidate of the party, than to defect to the candidate of the other side. So the typical US presidential election is usually decided by only 3 to 5 percentage points. This is a chart that, let me see if, yeah. This is a chart that illustrates the gender gap over time. See this on my can, but I don't see it here. I'll just point to it. These are elections from 1952 to 2016, and this is a vote that's more Democratic than Republican, and this is a vote that's more Republican than Democratic. And the orange dots are the votes of men, and the blue dots are the votes of women. So early in this period, you can see that both men and women, this is the Eisenhower era, were more likely to vote Republican than Democratic. But with, even then, in this period, women were more Republican than men. But sometime in the 70s and 80s, this shifted. And women began to vote more for the Democratic candidate, while men persisted in voting more for the Republican candidate. And this gender gap has become very important in contemporary politics because since the 80s, women have become a majority of the electorate, and they're also voting at a higher rate than men. This is another important element of the contemporary electorate. This is the proportion of non-Hispanic whites in the voting population. And you can see this has been declining from about 85% to about 74% in elections over this period. And these are both presidential elections and congressional elections. That's the zigzag pattern. And the proportion of whites in the presidential electorate has been declining. The Obama campaign set a target in 2012 of 72% white. They thought if the non-Hispanic white portion of the electorate was 72% or less, they would probably win comfortably. That is important because of the basic demographic shifts in the American population over time. Now this is actually a projection from 2012 to 2060. And you can see that all whites in the top bar are going to decline from 78 to 69%. Non-Hispanic whites, that chart I just showed you, are going to decline from 63 to 43%. America is on the way by 2045 or so to becoming a white minority population. This is a combination of a number of factors, birth rates, immigration, and so on. But this is one of the main factors that advantages the Democrats in the short term and going forward. Not only the demographic shifts in the population, but also the difference in the positions of the parties on issues like immigration or other issues related to minority access to various elements of democratic society. Polarization is the next thing that I want to talk about. You've probably heard a fair amount about this. This is a combination of factors that can be represented by the fact that Democrats and Republicans hold different positions, that there's a number of studies that show that Democrats and Republicans are now living separately in different neighborhoods. There's less contact between Democrats and Republicans, and there's more dislike of members of the other party. Polarization starts in the Congress, and this is a set of charts showing voting patterns in the Congress and the level of compromise, or compromise defined as cross-party voting. So if we come here to the 97th Congress in 1981, you can see the dark distribution is the is the Democrats on the left, and the light distribution is the Republicans on the right, more conservative. But you can see that there's a great deal of overlap, a lot of cross-party voting. And as you go over time, up to around 2000, you can see the two distributions separate. And if you look here in the 110th Congress that got seated in 2007 and 2009 and 2011, there's almost no cross-party voting. So this is elite behavior that we classify as polarization. This is one of the factors that explains why Congress isn't getting anything done. There's no compromise, and because of the rules of the game, it becomes virtually impossible to put together a sufficient majority to pass legislation. But this is another element of polarization. These are answers to a similar but not exactly the same question asked in 1960, 2008, and 2010. Would you be displeased if a member of your family married someone from the other party? In 1960, 4% of Democrats said that, and 5% of Republicans. In 2008, the question was worded slightly differently, and the proportion who said they would be somewhat or very upset was 20% of Democrats and 27% of Republicans. And in the last measurement, in 2010, it was 1/3 of Democrats and just about half of Republicans. So this is how polarization has taken root or taken hold in the population as a whole. This is a chart that shows trends in the economic recovery across the last 50 years. So this is the population divided into quintiles. Here's 4 of them. Each one is 20% of the population, right? And you can see in 67 they were very close. And here's the separation. Here's the top 5% of the population. Their income has increased 879% in 50 years. This increase is barely 20% across 50 years. So there's a lot of anxiety related to these facts. One of them is about current state the current state of inequality. And some of it gets translated into how older Americans feel about their children's prospects for the future. So this state of economic well-being in the population, coupled with the activities of Congress, is what precipitated a lot of this concern about somebody not from Washington. This is another chart showing the same data for the same period. But here's the bottom quintile, where the median income half earn more and half earn less, where the median income has increased from 18,600 to 22,800 across 50 years. And for the 95th percentile, it's gone from 118,000 to 214,000, or an 87% increase. Here is a chart across the last 45 years. These are Gallup data as well, about trust in the Congress. And there's been a lot of research on this, what the cause or the basis for this is. I mentioned one factor, which is lack of productivity. This is related to economic conditions as well. And it depends to some extent on which party is holding the presidency. So Democrats have less confidence in the Congress when there's a Republican president. Republicans have less confidence in the Congress when there's a Democratic president. But this is just a pretty simple secular decline in confidence, allowing for some variations in how well the economy is doing, and so on. So how did this get translated into the two conventions? First of all, one of them is one issue is about the role of terrorism in the current campaign, or what the government should be doing about terrorism. This was a central issue, as one would expect, for the convention of the party out of power, the Republicans, less of an issue for the Democrats. These concerns about the state of the economy also lead to an increased interest in better management of the economy and equity for all. There is a latent, not often discussed explicitly, concern about the role of whites and the place of whites in society. And this, I think, is closely related to attitudes about immigration in society. And then there's a concern about the role of government in citizens' lives, which has been a very common difference between Democrats and Republicans, about the size of government and about the activities of government. But one thing that's going on, which is very unusual, is the financial standing of each campaign, which, and this shows that Hillary Clinton, at the end of the summer, had much more money in the bank than Donald Trump. But a difference in campaign styles. Donald Trump is not actively raising money. He hasn't participated in many fundraisers. He's taken about as much advantage of free media as any candidate has in any recent presidential campaign. I don't know how many people watched this event Friday at the hotel in Washington.
Wonderful marching too.
Yeah, I mean, they set this event for 10 o'clock. The cameras went on at 10 o'clock. The main people who served as the backdrop didn't show up till about 10:45. Trump came on about 11:05 or 11:10. But then he let a bunch of people speak first. Some Congressional Medal of Honor winners, some union members who had participated in the construction of the hotel. Then he came on at the very end which was about 11:45, for 1 minute and 37 seconds, and said, Donald Trump was born in the Barack Obama was born in the United States, period. Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2008 was responsible for the start of this, but I finished it. And then, they walked off the stage. So he kept a lot of the national media, not all of the national media. He kept their attention and on television with cameras for almost 2 hours with almost no content. But that's sort of typical, and it's actually a symbol of a great deal of skill that he has in maintaining name recognition. I'm going to show you some data from this new project from Gallup in a little bit, but he's been very good at this. So he has a smaller staff than Hillary Clinton. He doesn't have as many paid staff members in the states. The ground campaign, as we learned to appreciate it during the 2 Obama campaigns, is virtually non-existent. He's been trying to coordinate and in general piggyback off of a close relationship with the Republican National Committee, who has some data analytics. But we're not going to know until Election Day whether this is a successful strategy or not. We've been working with the Gallup organization for almost 2 months on a project where they are interviewing people, 500 people a night, and asking them, have you heard or read or seen anything about Hillary Clinton in the last few days? And if they say yes, they're asked in an open-ended question, what was it? And the same question is asked about Donald Trump. And the first thing to report is at least 70% of Americans answer this question, yes, I heard something. And these are forms of what we call word clouds. And this issue about the emails has followed her constantly since this data collection began on August 10th. Almost invariably, until the last week, when health became the most commonly used word or phrase. Donald Trump on the right, you can see that there's much more, the font size is related to the relative mention of the word or phrase or topic. You can see in the Trump picture on the right that there's much more variation. The words tend to fluctuate with what he says or what he does if he takes a trip to Mexico, or if he talks about immigration and the wall, and so on. These are data aggregated across 9 weeks. This picture might be a little hard for you to see, but these are the 9 weeks. And they go from the beginning of the data collection to the last week. And you can see for Clinton, the top word is email, email, until the convention. Email, 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 help. This is really dogging her through the campaign. On the Republican side, you can see president, convention, Russia, family, Obama, campaign, immigration, Mexico, Mexico, Obama. Depending upon what Donald Trump talks about and the way in which he presents the information, the venue, he's getting a lot of coverage on a variety of things. But you notice for both of them an absence of mention of policy. Health is not related to health policy. Health is related to the state or condition of Hillary Clinton's health. This is has been a relatively policy-free campaign so far. So what is likely to happen in the fall? I'm going to show you a couple of electoral college maps that are produced by news organizations. And I'll tell you the bottom line first, that most news organizations and most modelers expect Hillary Clinton to win the election, but by a much closer margin than they would have told you maybe in August. This is a map, I call this the conservative map only because it has the smallest margin. It comes from CNN. And it shows Hillary Clinton with 273 electoral votes, 270 are needed to win, 201 are solid, and 72 are from leaning states, the light-colored ones. Donald Trump has 191, 158 solid, 33 leaning, and there are 111 toss-up states, in 111 votes in 8 toss-up states. In this map, if Donald Trump took all of the toss-up electoral votes, he'd still be 1 short, 2 short. Okay. This is the map from NBC. I call this the aggressive map because they allocate differently, and they have given more electoral votes to Hillary Clinton, 272, 190 solid, 82 leaning. Trump, 163, 127 solid, 36 leaning with 103 toss-up. You know, as you know, presidential elections are now carried out mostly in 10 or 12 states, the so-called battleground states. And that's where the candidates spend their time and where they spend their money. And that's where the election is going to be decided. There are a number of websites that estimate the outcome of the election, either by popular vote and or electoral votes. And most of them, because they're statistical models, can now add a confidence level to the estimate. So the New York, you can see, first of all, that they're all estimating a Democratic victory. There are no pink or red bars here. For the New York Times, as of this morning, it's 74% chance for Clinton. This is Nate Silver, 59% chance. That is the lowest. This is Daily Kos, but they're working with a political scientist who had the most accurate model in 2012. 65% Democrat. Predict-wise, this is a composite of models, 72%. This is the Princeton Election Consortium, 88%. And these are 3 experts, the Cook Political Report, Roth, and Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia. But the race has been tightening, as you know, and this has been problematic for me as a person who studies polling and the use of polls in journalism, because the estimates are all over the lot. And what that means is it's very likely that some polls are going to be wrong. And there are 2 reasons for this. One of them is that the likely voter models are becoming very troublesome for pollsters. We now believe that Barack Obama was a very special candidate, and we can't use the turnout models from 2008 and 2012 to predict the electorate in 2016. But some of them have reverted to 2004, and we don't know how good a model or a prototype of what the electorate will look like then, that looked like it did then, will be now. Here's an example I picked out from a website this morning to show the difference in the estimates that samples are producing. So here are the people who are in a likely voter model who are leaning towards Clinton. They will vote or are likely to vote for Clinton. And each one of these dots is an estimate from a single poll. And the bar is the average of the estimates. Okay? You can see that generally there's consensus, for example, that there's consensus that blacks will vote for Hillary Clinton. And the average is 81%. For this here. The average is 81%. And you can see that there's some variance here. The dots are not all in the same place. Here is support for Clinton among women. The average is a 12-point advantage. But one poll way down the bottom from Morning Consult has her with a 4-point advantage. This doesn't seem real. But obviously this will affect the net assessment that Morning Consult will make in their pre-election estimate. There have been some attempts to look at the demographic composition, but also the partisan division of the likely electorate in the polls. And so these are data on the composition of partisanship in the polls. The average is 35% Democratic, 35.3, and 33.9 Republican. More Republicans, more Democrats than Republicans. I'm sorry, that was independents, 30.1 Republican, right? So it's 5.2 percentage points on average more Democrats than Republicans. But in the Democratic column, there's an 8 percentage point difference in the estimates. The high is this poll by Fox that was 40% Democratic, and this one by CNN that was 32% Democratic. And in fact, this poll, which showed Donald Trump ahead, had almost as many Republicans, and it had one of the highest numbers of independents. Partisanship is one of the most powerful predictors of vote. And if you have looked at polling data, you know that about 85% of Republicans say they're going to vote for Donald Trump, and about 90% of Democrats say they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton. So knowing whether somebody is a Democrat or Republican is a very important hint about how they're likely to vote. But in a sample of voters, having the right ratio of Democrats to Republicans is very important to estimating the outcome. It's also important to get the proportion of African Americans or the proportion of Hispanics correct in the sample. In the 2012 election, virtually every African American, 95% who went to the polls voted for Barack Obama. And about 2 out of 3 Hispanics who went to the polls voted for Barack Obama. So this ratio of the race and ethnicity of the sample respondents is also very important. Many people think that what the election is really about is the Senate and the Supreme Court nominations. And this is some data from the New York Times model this morning about the odds of the Democrats taking control of the Senate. And the odds are about 51% that they will. This is, if you run simulations, the length of this bar is how many simulations come with this outcome. And you can see that one of the most likely outcomes is 50-50. If Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, then the vice president will cast the deciding vote in any tie votes. But it'll be nip and tuck about what happens. So what are things to look for in the last 7 weeks? Well, the first thing would be where the candidates are traveling. Their travel behavior is modeled very carefully. And they'll be in the swing states, and you want to watch where they go, but you also want to take note, if you can, of where they stop going. You know, we have a history in Michigan, candidates visiting the state up until maybe October 1st, and then they stop. In recent elections, the Democrats have taken the lead in the polls. So that's one thing. The second is what happens in the first debate. The debates often don't have very much consequence in campaigns because people have crystallized their views about the candidates by the time they take place. And we know that it's not so much the size of the live audience as it is the coverage of the debates in the first or second news cycle afterwards. And they're now expecting the first debate to have the highest audience ever because it'll be the first real debate for Donald Trump. He won't be standing up with 8 or 10 or he never stood up with more than 10 Republicans. He'll be standing there with Hillary Clinton. And a lot of the reaction to the debates for many people, not necessarily those who pay a lot of attention to politics, but there'll be a lot of discussion about expectations and who's supposed to do better. And so a lot of the evaluation will be against these prior expectations and how well they do. And the news organizations will be collecting views from voters the night after the debate and into the next day, asking them who won the debate. And this is another important area where the methodology of the polls can make a difference, who they ask and what the sample looks like and whether they're viewers or not. I think another important thing is whether or not the Republican National Committee shifts its advertising budget to the Senate races after October 1st. We'll know about this because there are private firms that track where the candidates are making buys. And they know how many gross rating points the candidates have purchased in various media markets. So it'll be very important to observe essentially the bet that the Republican National Committee is making on Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton compared to what they might consider to be a better investment of the money in Senate races in order to try to maintain control of the Senate. Those are the comments that I prepared, and I'm happy as always to take questions if you have them. Yes?
I just have a couple. Does anybody point to any non-traditional voters perhaps coming out for Trump who don't normally vote? And then also on the other side, do you anticipate additional women voters coming out because there's a women's candidate?
Right. So the first question is about non-traditional voters. And this is one of the big guesses, I think, for the pollsters because the survey data show that there's a disproportionate support for Donald Trump among non-college educated whites. And turnout among non-college educated people is generally less than the turnout among college educated people. But it's possible that the intensity of their feeling for his candidacy, could counterbalance that. And with regard to women's support of Hillary Clinton, we haven't gotten to a stage in the campaign where she has tried to campaign on that issue, the historic nature of her candidacy. And as you saw from this chart that I put up early in my presentation, the Democrats have enjoyed a considerable advantage among women in recent elections. And so the question that you're asking really is, will there be an added effect of the Clinton candidacy beyond the normal advantage that Democrats have with women? We haven't seen it yet. Yes?
So this would seem a really good time for a third-party candidate to take advantage of a very disgruntled electorate. But it seems to me like I'm not hearing much from them other than the gap that they make. Is there any interest there?
Well,
Could they play a factor in, decreasing the?
the short form of the answer is I don't think so. And if political scientists were to agree that the American political system is rigged in any way, it's rigged against minor party candidates. It's very difficult to get ballot access. The requirements, for example, for signatures or for payments are usually very high. And in order to organize a national campaign, you'd have to, we don't really have national elections, right? We have 50 simultaneous state level elections held more or less on the same day. They're not held on the same day anymore. So in a presidential campaign, to organize a third or fourth party effort probably will not be successful until we have a drastic change in the rules that we have. And the changes in the rules can't be done by the Congress or at the national level. They have to come state by state by state. So I think it's not too likely. The debate system is set up to maximize production values for the television networks that produce them. And that's why we have these rules about 15% minimum in an average of certain polls. It's to keep the stage from getting cluttered. Cluttered as a news value, right? So that works to their disadvantage as well in terms of name recognition, fundraising, and so on. Yes?
I just wanted your opinion on a couple of things. When you talked about polarization, I grew up in an era where news coverage was the facts. This stuff is fantasy. And my other question is, to me as a marketing person, it just seems like Trump is building his brand. Any news is good news for him.
Well, let me start with the second point first. One thing that we may never know is how serious he was initially about becoming a presidential candidate as opposed to building his brand. I mean, if you remember that one of the first press conferences he had at Mar-a-Lago, where he appeared at the front of an auditorium, but he had his wine and the steaks on the table and so on, right? It's clear there was at least a sense initially that this would be good for his business. And I think the event at the hotel was, one of these, on Friday, was one of these events that was good for his business. Remind me about the first part again?
The news organization.
Oh, yeah. So I heard this interesting phrase driving to work, I think it was sometime last week, which was asymmetric fact-checking. And it was a term that was used to describe the diligence with which journalists are fact-checking statements that Hillary Clinton makes, especially with regard to the emails, because, I think that this is self-inflicted in a large part, right? Because the wording changes very slightly from one explanation to another. And so they dig in to find out why she's parsing, what the difference would be. While at the same time, Donald Trump makes these outrageous statements, and they're discounted, but without the same level of fact-checking and the production of counterfacts, counterfactuals. There has been a shift since the hotel event. I think, I don't know this for certain, but I think if we did a content analysis of the news, we would find the term lie appearing more frequently in the press coverage of Donald Trump than in the period before that. I think that after the campaign is all over, the hotel event could turn out to be a kind of a tipping point in the coverage. Now, we can't really trace the coverage systematically from last Friday forward, because there's too many things that are going to happen in between, including the debates. But I think we would observe this, I think we could observe this difference for at least 10 days until the first debate on Monday. There are a lot of angry commentators who think that they were taken on Friday.
They were.
So, yes?
Could you talk about voter trading and if you think it might take off, and if so, will it have an impact?
I missed the word.
Voter trading.
Trade?
Where you don't want to vote for one candidate, but there might be somebody in another state where that candidate would be okay, and they agree to vote for a different the candidate you would vote
Yeah.
for, and you want to vote.
Yeah, okay, I'm with you.
Okay.
I don't think it's likely to to take off. It's hard. First of all, it's a difficult calculation for a lot of
I
people.
did not explain it well. If you could explain it better than I did. Because these, I get a sense that nobody knows what I'm talking about.
Well, it's a vote. It can either be a vote canceling technique, or there are a lot of people now who invest in campaigns by looking on the computer to see which races are the closest, because the race in their state doesn't seem to be very competitive. Their money doesn't gain very much by giving to, their party's candidate. But maybe it would make a difference to give it to a candidate in another state where, where the race is close. And vote trading is the same concept, although it doesn't apply as directly. So I live in state X, and Donald Trump is way ahead. I offer to vote for Hillary Clinton in my state if somebody in a closer state will agree to vote for Donald Trump. And there are people experimenting with this, with websites, but I don't think it's going to turn out to be very popular, because I don't think that a vote is as much of a commodity as the people who organize these efforts think it is. That people are more personally invested in casting their vote the way they want to, and that they'll continue to do it, even if it won't affect the outcome in their state, say for the Electoral College delegation. Yes?
As a pollster, where do you get your sample? How is it determined? How do you contact?
Yeah. So I'm not really a pollster, but I can tell you how it's done mostly. Almost all of the interviewing is still done on the telephone. Although, as you may know, there's a lot of economic pressure, big economic forces at work in the news industry. And news organizations are the primary sponsors of polls. So when news organizations get squeezed financially, the pollsters get squeezed to find cheaper ways to collect data. So there's been a shift towards web-based interviews, internet interviews. Most of American campaigns nowadays are about mobilization, identifying your voters and getting them to the polls. So if he doesn't have a good ground game, first of all, he has this identification and mobilization problem. I think the likely voter models are in trouble on both sides. I think for the Trump campaign, it's getting their supporters to the polls, who are mostly, as I indicated earlier, white and male. But it's also a problem for the Clinton campaign in getting African Americans, Hispanics, and women to the polls in expected or greater than expected numbers. And I think that's what puts all of the pollsters at risk in terms of their likely voter models. There was this CNN poll that had this lead for Donald Trump about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago maybe, had a majority of voters over 50. And this is one of these examples where it looked like maybe something similar to the 2004 electorate, but not to the 2008 or 12 electorate. What young people do in this campaign is also important for the turnout models. I mean, I think because of, you probably know that these are the two most disliked candidates ever to run in the presidential election in the polling era. So I think this is probably a low turnout election. And in a low turnout election, the estimate of which people go to the polls and who they're going to support is more important, I think, than in a high turnout election. And that also complicates the role of the pollsters. Yes?
Do you think the Real Clear Politics average is a good index to follow, or would you recommend another one to?
Well, the Real Clear Politics is not my favorite, only because it's relatively unsophisticated. It's an average of polls. So there are some statistical modelers who combine polls. You know, all of these models are based upon polling data, but combine polls in a different way. And what I would recommend is to go to the New York Times. They have this section called the Upshot, and this page comes from the New York Times. It's a composite of the estimates. And if you clicked on one of those logos, you would get to the details of that, you know, particular estimate. So this to me is the best summary of what's going on, and also the pointers to the right place to get more detail. Yeah. Sure.
Do you ever foresee future electoral college changes, such as the popular vote? This person
I don't see this in the short term. You know, this goes back to the Constitutional Convention, the big states and the little states. And, you know, the little states have got to agree to give something up, you know, in order to do this. I mean, if you think about the state of California, almost a fifth of the U.S. population, they have no role in the selection of candidates or in the campaign, or they have a lot of electoral votes for the Democratic candidate. But they hold their primary just about last in the calendar, because running an election is a very expensive proposition. They don't want to hold a special beauty contest primary for delegates. They tried this once and they didn't like it, and it cost them a lot of money. So we really should have a popular election for president. We'd get better campaigns, and we'd have more responsive candidates. But I don't see it coming in the short term.
Professor Trauben, on behalf of the Wolverine Caucus and the Alumni Association, I want to present you this gift as a token
Thank you.
of our esteem. Wasn't he amazing? So I just know so much more about this election cycle, and if any of you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, let me know, and we'll be sure to get it to you quickly. Also, this will be aired on local public access stations over the next few months. I want to also thank Representative Marsha Hovey-Wright and Representative Paul Clementi for joining us today, and the two co-chairs of the Wolverine Caucus for all the years that we have had this wonderful forum are here today as well, Craig Ruff and Tom Scott. So I want to thank you both. We've always enjoyed our collaborative efforts of bringing forums to you that are interesting. We look forward to seeing you in 2017 when we have more interesting forums, and by then we'll know which of the predictions took place in November of 2016 on the election. So again, thank you for your support of the Wolverine Caucus, and we will see you soon. Take care and go forward.
Well,